So Dr. Corrie, you talked about this exercise that you run with your students called the Game of Life. And I was wondering if you could talk more about what the role of simulation games like that is for raising awareness with youth and teaching them about some of the structures that exist in our society.
In my talk, I talked about my own experience as a teenager when I was part of a simulation game as part of my own United Methodist youth group experience of, this was in the 80s, experiencing what the discrimination and separation of peoples was like in apartheid South Africa. And I vividly remember this as a conversion moment. This was the moment when I realized that there was something unjust happening in the world that needed to stop, and that God was calling me to have some role in stopping it. And not just working to stop it over there, but also making the translation to figure out what's going on in my own country that is similar to this, the racism in my own country. And so when I didn't quite realize this until later, but we adopted a practice at YTI called the Game of Life, and it's a simulation game that very complex, but all the young people get different identities that they don't know what the identity is on a label, and they get treated differently through this game by staff people who are told to treat them differently based on their label, and those labels are about socioeconomic class, but they're also about ethnicity, ability, immigrant status, ability status, lots of different ways of slicing up the different groups that we have in our society and the way that we treat them differently. And what we've come to discover in doing this game is that there's something about physically being part of this activity that teaches you a lesson in a way that I could get up and give a lecture about intersectionality and how oppression is complicated and nuanced, and they could be like, oh, okay, and take notes in a notebook. But to actually feel what it's like to see someone else in a game have more money than you, having a better time in the game than you, or to realize that you were having a great time playing this game and that you didn't notice until the end that someone who you're friends with was having a terrible time in the game. There's something about having gone through that experience that makes light bulbs go off. Students often ask as we're doing the debrief, oh, that doesn't really happen in real life exactly, does it? And as soon as they say that, before they've even finished saying it, there'll be other people in the room going, oh, yes, it does. And then that opens up the door for them to share a narrative of how exactly that kind of microaggression or act of violence or discrimination actually was experienced by them or someone they love. And so it opens up that the sharing of stories in a way that wouldn't happen any other way. If we sat in a circle and I said, okay, Jonah, tell me about a time in which you were discriminated against. That would be a really awkward conversation. But if we actually experience it physically and we have concrete examples, oh, did you notice how Jonah was treated in a certain way, but Elizabeth was treated in a different way? Why do you think that was? That opens up a much more in-depth way of thinking about it. And that is the beginning of our program at YTI. So we have this experience, and then we take them out and show them how this complex set of systemic discrimination works in the world, whether it's homelessness or sex trafficking or gentrification or the mosque down the street or the synagogue down the street. Like, they start to notice these different nuances, and we can point it out because in that simulation game we can say, well, remember that time that Jonah was discriminated in this way? Well, that's what they're talking about over here when they say they're experiencing discrimination in a particular way. And so we've done this for 5 years now, and alumni come back and say in the program evaluations and in their reflections later that that's one of the most poignant memories of going through the program is doing the Game of Life. They just remember how they felt. I mean, we know from research that you learn lessons when there's strong emotions associated. You remember things better. They feel anger They feel sadness and despair. They feel glee and happiness, all in the midst of a 30 or 45-minute exercise in this social experiment. And so they never forget it because those strong emotions are associated with that learning.